Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 16 running back rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with matchups, then transitioning into my top 36 running back rankings. If you guys are looking for my thoughts on an individual running back, travel down to the description of the video. We have timestamps available there, like in every single video. Additionally, while you're down in the description, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and, of course, click the bell notification button. Besides putting out the daily content in order to help you capture a 2024 fantasy football championship, we're also answering questions live every single day via the live stream. Again, later tonight at 7 p.m. If you have any questions regarding waiver wire and or starter set questions going into Week 16, be sure to swing on by. I'm more than happy to help. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin by talking about matchups going into Week 16. Based on statistics allowed via rushing statistics, rushing yards, and rushing touchdowns by each individual defense between weeks 6 through 15. We found that the Panthers, Giants, Saints, Bears, Jaguars, 49ers, etc. are the most advantageous matchups going into the given week. And of course, based on their performances over the course of the last 2 months, these defenses have given us the indication that they cannot stop the run. And if we have a running back taking them on within a given week, of course, we should anticipate a high upside for success based on averages over the course of this span of time. Either way, I just wanted to go ahead and present some of the more advantageous matchups. We'll go into even further detail when I talk about these running backs on an individual basis, but I also want to talk about some of the more disadvantageous matchups, because even though you may be taking on the Eagles, the Broncos, the Dolphins, the Falcons within a given week, it does not mean that you're completely out of potential for success. Bijan Robinson Jr. and Austin Ekeler back in Week 11 taking on the Eagles both found themselves fantasy success. And once again this week, there's a possibility in which Bijan Robinson Jr. can do the same in terms of finding the end zone and being fantasy relevant. So even though he has the most difficult matchup at the position, don't let that be the only reason why you are looking away from him going into the given week. Of course, this is just context into the big picture with all these variables taken into account. With this covered, let's get into our top 36 running back rankings, beginning with our number one, the thumbnail of today's episode, Jahmyr Gibbs. Unfortunately, yesterday we all heard the news. David Montgomery is out for the remainder of the season. If we travel back to the 2023 season, weeks 7 and 8, 2 games in which, of course, Jahmyr Gibbs played without David Montgomery in the lineup. Jahmyr Gibbs, throughout that span of time, in those 2 weeks, was averaging 25.5 touches per game and 25.25 half PPR fantasy points per game. Over the course of his career, in games in which he has been given 19 or more touches, he is averaging 21.01 fantasy points per game, and he has done that in 8 separate games. Again, with opportunity comes success, and with a player as efficient as Jahmyr Gibbs behind an incredibly elite offensive line, you would anticipate that in the absence of David Montgomery, all of the opportunity share will be going in the direction of Jahmyr Gibbs. Taking on the Chicago Bears, again, they are the 4th best matchup at the position, allowing over 18 fantasy points per game and a half PPR just on the ground alone, allowing over 4.8 yards per carry on average. We have most recently seen, just last night, of course, Minnesota, 2 rushing touchdowns from their running backs and over 100 yards. San Francisco, over 100 yards and 3 touchdowns. Detroit, last time out against this defense, just a couple weeks back, ran for 175 rushing yards as a duo between Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs. We are anticipating top-tier upside for Gibbs. If you have a possibility of putting in an anytime touchdown for him via Underdog, be sure to do so. For those of you who are interested, be sure to travel down to the description and check out Underdog today. If you sign up using code Andrew and make that first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only will you be able to claim the first-time deposit offer, but get my rankings sent to you every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. These rankings are by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, includes flex. So for those of you interested, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. If in fact you are not eligible and still want those rankings, you can find it via the Patreon, also linked down in the description. Thank you very much. Okay, let's continue on with our number 2. Another top-tier auto-star running back, we have Saquon Barkley. For those of you who have Saquon Barkley, if you manage to survive his 74 total yards with 0 touchdowns this most recent week, of course, consider yourself lucky, because the remainder of the fantasy playoffs are incredibly advantageous matchups for Saquon Barkley this week, taking on the Washington Commanders. Again, last time out against the Commanders, back in Week 11, a Thursday night football game, Saquon Barkley, 26 rushing attempts for 146 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, and scored 32.8 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. The Commanders are the 9th best matchup at the position, allowing over 16 fantasy points per game on the ground on a per game average since week 6, and allowing 4.8 yards per carry to opposing running backs. Even though this most recent week, the Eagles really wanted to prove a point that they can continue to pass the ball to find success and succeed as an offense, I'd anticipate that they get back to running the ball and, of course, utilizing Saquon Barkley, their best offensive weapon. Number 3, we have Josh Jacobs, who has been incredible as of late. Of course, in 6 of the last 7 games, accumulating over 100 total yards. He has scored 11 touchdowns in those last 7 games. Since week 8 of the 2024 fantasy football season, he has been the number 1 overall running back in terms of fantasy points per game on average, averaging 21.53 in a half PPR throughout that span of time. Taking on the Saints, the 3rd best matchup at the position, allowing over 18.5 fantasy points per game and nearly 5 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs. You would anticipate a running back at the caliber of Josh Jacobs to continue a streak of success, whether it is on the ground or through the air. Number 4, speaking of production on the ground through the air, that is exactly what Chase Brown has done as he has taken over this backfield and the National Football League since week 9. Since week 9, he's the number 3 overall running back in terms of fantasy points per game on average, 20.42. Again, incredible production, having put up 100 total offensive yards in 5 of the last 6 games and has scored 6 total touchdowns in those 6 games. Even though Joe Mixon's having himself an incredible season thus far with the Houston Texans, Joe Mixon, what Chase Brown has been able to accomplish over the course of this back end of the season really has given us the credence to understand that really whoever is in this backfield is going to find success. And based on the upside that he has presented within the receiving game, of course, Chase Brown continuing to find success is an auto start, especially considering they take on the Cleveland Browns, who have most recently allowed 88 rushing yards to Kansas City running backs, 103 to Pittsburgh running backs, and 97 to Denver running backs. Earlier today, it was announced that DTR, Dorian Thompson-Robinson, will be starting for the Cleveland Browns. Expect this to be a blowout in the favor of the Cincinnati Bengals. On number 5, we have Bijan Robinson to close out the S tier. Besides the fact that Bijan Robinson has put up over 100 total yards in 8 of the last 9 games, this week has an opportunity of taking on the 2nd best matchup at the position, taking on the New York Giants. The Giants are allowing over 19 fantasy points per game, or allowing 4.76 yards per carry to opposing running backs, and have allowed over 100 rushing yards to opposing running backs in 4 of the last 5 games. Again, Carolina 158 and a touchdown. Tampa Bay 127, 3 touchdowns. Dallas 116 and a touchdown. New Orleans 81 and a touchdown. And most recently, the Baltimore Ravens running backs combining for 106 rushing yards in their efforts. All right, let's move on to the A tier. We move on to James Conner, our number 6. Look, James Conner is coming off an incredible performance of 28.3 fantasy points, and it's not going to slow down anytime soon as they take on the Carolina Panthers. Of course, James Conner is coming off of 3 consecutive games in which he has had 20 or more touches while averaging 5.25 yards per carry on average throughout that span of time. He's been on a 6-game consecutive streak of getting 3+ receptions, so whether it's on the ground or through the air, he's finding success and now has an opportunity of taking on the number 1 matchup at the position. This defense allowing over 19.3 fantasy points per game on average to opposing running backs. These are the most recent performances from running backs and backfields against this defense. Dallas 179 on the ground, Philadelphia 150, Tampa Bay 228, and the New York Giants 143. I'd like to assume that James Conner continues that streak with an incredible performance to continue to help our fantasy teams get to Championship Sunday. Moving on to our number 7, we have James Cook. Again, James Cook is coming off of an incredible performance of 25.8 fantasy points in a very difficult matchup against the Detroit Lions. Being able to accomplish that all while Josh Allen continues to vulture rushing touchdowns is incredibly impressive considering the difficulty of said matchup. But nonetheless, even though Josh Allen has scored a rushing touchdown in 5 consecutive games, James Cook was able to find the end zone twice, which is very promising considering the Bills as a team have scored over 30 points in the last 8 consecutive games. You would assume that James Cook is in line this week against the New England Patriots to at least score once, if not twice. The Patriots are the 7th best matchup at the position, allowing nearly 17 fantasy points per game on the ground, 4.7 yards per carry to opposing running backs. We have most recently seen the Arizona Cardinals and James Conner, like I just recently mentioned, go for 147 on the ground and 2 touchdowns as a backfield. You would anticipate that James Cook can continue this streak of success against a run-stop defense that, quite frankly, does not exist over the course of this entire season. Number 8, we have De'Von Achane. Look, De'Von Achane is purely going to have himself upside in the receiving category, and that is it. Within the rushing category, if he's able to find himself 40, 50 rushing yards, we are lucky in that sense. But going into this week, again, the 49ers, they are allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game on the ground to opposing running backs, which is obviously a great sign because, again, if they're going to allow a breakout run by De'Von Achane, that's really just going to get us closer to scoring 20 fantasy points by the end of the given week. Because what he's able to do through the air is everything. In 9 of the last 10 games with Tua Tagovailoa under center, De'Von Achane has had 4 or more receptions. Again, this most recent week, 7 catches and 35 receiving yards. He's only had 1 rushing attempt of over 10 rushing yards in the last 4 games. Again, the receiving upside is everything for De'Von Achane. But luckily, of course, he takes on the 49ers, who have given up recently 113 on the ground to the LA Rams, 198 on the ground to the Buffalo Bills, 158 on the ground to the Green Bay Packers, and 104 on the ground to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Potentially, De'Von Achane is in line for a great game on the ground and, of course, what he continues to do through the air. The next running back I wanted to mention is Derrick Henry, our number 9. Look, Derrick Henry, if you are one of the many who potentially survived his lackluster performance of 6.7 fantasy points, consider yourself lucky. But as we continue, hopefully he's going to find himself in the end zone. He has yet to score a touchdown. I think it's 3 consecutive weeks in a row in which he hasn't scored a rushing touchdown. This is obviously worrisome, but luckily he takes on the Pittsburgh Steelers. Again, this Steelers defense is the 12th best matchup at the position, allowing nearly 15 fantasy points per game on the ground, over 4 yards per carry. Going into this week, I would anticipate that Derrick Henry should be in line to score a touchdown on the ground. Last time out against his defense in week 11, 13 carries, 65 yards and a touchdown. Also fumbled once, 10.5 fantasy points. I expect a lot more potential for fantasy upside within the given matchup, especially considering the Baltimore Ravens offense should be performing at a far higher level in comparison to where they were earlier this season when they took on the Pittsburgh Steelers. To close out the A tier, we have Joe Mixon. Now, Joe Mixon wasn't the only running back this last week that, of course, had themselves a lackluster performance. Saquon Barkley and, of course, Derrick Henry, 2 other running backs in that top 3 conversation, obviously left us hanging. But if you survived, consider yourself lucky, because going forward, again, Joe Mixon should be able to get back on the saddle and continue to find success. He has had himself over 100 total yards in 7 of the last 10 games. He has scored a touchdown minimum in 8 of the last 10 games, even though the Chiefs have only allowed over 75 rushing yards twice to opposing teams in terms of their backfields, and they're only allowing 3.98 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs thus far this season since week 6. Understand that Joe Mixon is in the perfect position to succeed based on the volume of opportunity he's being given, and considering we have a short week taking on the Kansas City Chiefs, 10 a.m. on Saturday. Again, I'll be live streaming here on the channel starting at 8 a.m. PST. On Saturday morning, if you have any questions, be sure to swing on by. If, in fact, Patrick Mahomes is not going to be himself and or potentially not even play, there could be an opportunity in which the Houston Texans can steal a victory here and, of course, do so in the efforts of Joe Mixon's rushing attack. Moving on to the B tier, we have Aaron Jones at number 11. Look, Aaron Jones has been incredible as late. He has scored 1 touchdown in the last 4 consecutive games. Even though last night, Cam Akers at the back end of that game stole a rushing touchdown on the goal line. It is what it is. They continue to give Cam Akers a lot of touches in the second half and in the late closing stages of that game in order to keep Aaron Jones healthy for the remainder of the year. This week, Aaron Jones takes on the Seattle Seahawks. They're allowing 4.82 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs and nearly 13.5 fantasy points per game on the ground. The most recent performances against this defense, Arizona 105 on the ground, and of course Green Bay 109 in a rushing touchdown. You would anticipate Aaron Jones to continue his streak of success once again this week. Number 12 is Jonathan Taylor. I don't really want to talk about it. Yes, he pulled a Deshaun Jackson. It is what it is. Continuing on, we are hoping that he has learned his lesson and isn't going to fumble the ball on the 1-yard line anymore. Continuing on, we have a conversation this week in which he is taking on the Tennessee Titans. Again, the Tennessee Titans are the 10th best matchup. We should find Jonathan Taylor with an abundance of success, especially considering we had the Cincinnati Bengals this most recent week run for 101 in a rushing touchdown. So if Jonathan Taylor isn't able to accomplish something of the similar sense in which he's able to at least score 15 to 20 fantasy points, I will be legitimately surprised, because we have seen, even Jacksonville 2 weeks ago, 75 in a rushing touchdown on the ground. Washington, 229 and 2 rushing touchdowns on the ground. This offense is a running attack. I would anticipate Jonathan Taylor to be given the ample opportunity share to find himself success and, of course, redeem himself from last week. Moving on to our number 13, we have Kyren Williams. Look, Kyren Williams has had himself back-to-back games of 31 touches. The elite level of usage continues to go in his direction, and taking on the New York Jets this week, I would anticipate that to continue. Considering the Los Angeles Rams are in pole position to win the NFC West, they're going to do everything they can in their power to find themselves victorious this week. And if that means handing the ball off to Kyren Williams 29 plus times, they'll do so. Because again, this offense is predicated on running the ball. And of course, we've most recently seen the Jacksonville Jaguars do whatever they wanted to do against that run-stop defense of the New York Jets. And of course, the pass defense that has been quite non-existent over the course of the season. So I would anticipate if Mac Jones can tear apart this defense, Matthew Stafford, Kyren Williams will certainly be capable of accomplishing that once again this week. Moving on to our number 14, Rico Dowdle. Rico Dowdle could very easily be ranked higher, but it's just purely a matter of, is he going to score a touchdown? Is he going to get himself receiving utilization? He's coming off a week in which he had 25 carries, 149, and that's it. No receptions, no touchdowns, nothing. But he has had 20 plus opportunities in each of the last 4 games. In the last 3 games, has totaled 120 total yards or more, and additionally has been incredibly efficient on the ground, averaging 6.03 yards per carry on average in the last 3 games and 4.35 yards after contact per attempt. These levels of efficiency, regardless of which defense you are taking on, are going to continue. I anticipate Rico Dowdle to be a solid top 15 option as he has been over the course of the last 3 weeks. If he scores a touchdown, he is easily a top 12 option. Moving on to our number 15, we have Chuba Hubbard. Very similar to Joe Mixon, Derrick Henry, we expected Chuba Hubbard to find himself in abundance of success against the Dallas Cowboys run-stop defense last week, and he was not able to. Of course, that game got out of hand relatively quickly. Of course, the Panthers were down 27-7 at one point early in the fourth quarter. So if we're going to be in a situation in which you're down that many points, of course, you're not going to run the ball anymore. But this week, taking on the Arizona Cardinals, we have an opportunity for Chuba Hubbard to get back on track. Again, this defense allowing 4.54 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs. They've most recently allowed performances from New England over 102 rushing yards on the ground. Seattle 172 and 2 rushing yards on the ground. So you would anticipate the Cardinals could struggle against Chuba Hubbard. And over the course of this entire season, in the 10 games in which Chuba Hubbard has been given 17 or more touches, he's averaging 16.94 fantasy points per game. In those 10 games in which he has been given 17 or more touches, has scored 9 total touchdowns. You would anticipate that in a game in which it could be a closer scoring matchup, he'd be given the ample opportunity and he could potentially deliver a fantastic fantasy performance once again this week. Moving on to our number 16, we have Bucky Irving. Now, I anticipate Bucky Irving to continue to split touches with Rachaad White in order to keep him healthy. Now, he's coming off a week in which he played 44% of the offensive snaps and was able to sustain a full game of production without re-injuring himself, which is a great sign. Now, this most recent week had 15 rushing attempts, 9 of which those 15 rushing attempts consisted of 4 or more rushing yards. Also had a huge run of 54 rushing yards, which again capped off his day with 12.3 fantasy points, which is fantastic. This week, they do take on the Dallas Cowboys. That run-stop defense has been elite over the course of the last 4 games. Weeks 12 through 15, they're only allowing 3.6 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs, in comparison to the fact that since week 6, they have been the 11th best matchup. So again, we have the most recent Dallas Cowboys iteration of this defense playing incredibly well. Hopefully, Bucky Irving will be up to the task on hand, taking on this great run-stop defense that has shown themselves lately. Moving on to our number 17, we have Isiah Guerendo. We know how this backfield works, and we have seen Isiah Guerendo over the course of the last 2 games handle 17 and 20 touches. The 17 touch game left early, of course, in that fourth quarter due to the injury. And of course, the 20 touch game against the LA Rams was a short week Thursday game in which he was still dealing with that injury. Obviously, another week separated from said injury should be fantastic within the overall opportunity share. As the lone back of the 49ers offense, you would anticipate that he should be able to find himself with 20 plus touches, and in that overall effort, at least find the end zone once to be a solid potential 12 to 15 point player within the given week. If they continue to give him receiving upside as they have over the course of the last 2 games, I would anticipate even higher upside in a full PPR sense. Moving on to our number 18, we have Bijan Robinson Jr. Now, I mentioned this earlier when we were talking about matchups in specific. Bijan Robinson taking on the Philadelphia Eagles, even though it is technically the most difficult matchup, it does not mean that he is going to be void of success. Back in week 11, 16 carries, 63 yards, and a rushing touchdown, 13.7 fantasy points, while Austin Eckler had 9 targets, 8 catches, 89 in that game. If Bijan Robinson is going to handle the entire workload of this offense, in a situation in which last week he ran the most routes amongst all running backs, 23, and had himself 3 targets, 3 receptions, 22. If we're going to be in a situation in which this offense continues to lean upon throwing the ball to their running backs in the Philadelphia Eagles matchup, expect for Bijan Robinson to continue a streak of success this week. Moving on to our number 19, Rachaad White. Look, Rachaad White has a knack for the end zone. The fact of the matter is, regardless of the Bucky Irving situation, Rachaad White is going to continue to get touches. Of course, most recently, had himself a game of 17 touches, 15 on the ground, 2 through the air, scored himself a touchdown once again. That is 7 touchdowns scored in the last 7 games. Within the red zone, he is a machine. And of course, has scored over 11 fantasy points in 6 of the last 7 games. Taking on the Dallas Cowboys, again, we've talked about it. They are pretty good in terms of stopping the run over the course of the last month of the season. But through the air is where Rachaad White typically finds his touchdown upside, and I would anticipate that he could very easily do that once again this week within the red zone as the Tampa Bay Buccaneers will continue to score on that secondary. Moving on to our number 20. To begin the D tier, this begins the streak of players in which we don't know whether they're 100% healthy and what kind of workload that they're going to see this week. Of course, Breece Hall coming off of a game in which he played only 44% of the offensive snaps. Of course, Braylon Allen went down with an injury, so Isaiah Davis split the overall touches and snaps within this backfield with Breece Hall. But Breece Hall was lucky enough to get himself within the red zone and on a 1-yard rushing attempt in order to score a touchdown thanks to a defensive pass interference call. So if we're going to be in a situation in which, of course, Breece Hall is going to see himself a full participation of practice over the course of this entire week, which we will keep monitored. If he practices fully the whole week, he will rise within my rankings. If he's still going to be limited with the knee injury, and we're going to be in a situation of a negative game script, I might not feel as confident starting him, and I may leave him at the number 20 spot as we progress. Now we move on to our number 21, Kenneth Walker. Again, under the assumption that Kenneth Walker does return this week, which again, I am assuming that is going to be the case, taking on the Minnesota Vikings, we are still yet to see what kind of practice participation he is going to see and whether this is going to be a split backfield. It very easily could split 50-50 between Kenneth Walker and Charbonnet in terms of the overall rushing opportunity and receiving workload like we have seen at times this season, but we'll have to wait and see what his overall practice report sets at. If he is going to be at a full participation over the course of this week, he will rise within my rankings as we get closer to Sunday, but as of right now, number 21 is safe considering there's always a possibility that Charbonnet has earned himself more touches within this backfield. Number 22, another running back that, of course, has been dealing with himself an injury. This most recent week, dealing with an ankle injury, which, of course, launched the overall upside of Tyjae Spears in his absence. But, of course, still returned to the game, still had himself a rushing touchdown, 45 rushing yards. Again, this most recent week, 17 touches is no joke. And when you take on the Indianapolis Colts this week, the 8th best matchup at the position, if Tony Pollard is healthy and ready to go, he would be significantly higher ranked. In fact, in my top 15 if he's fully healthy by this upcoming Friday's practice report. All right, let's move on to the E tier. Beginning with our number 23, we have Najee Harris. Look, 7 consecutive games of 16 plus rushing attempts unfortunately ended on Sunday against the Philadelphia Eagles, in which he only had 6 rushing attempts over the course of the entire game for 14 rushing yards. Now, going into week 16, I don't expect that level of production once again. I expect him to get back to his level of production in which we saw back in week 11 against the Baltimore Ravens. 18 carries for 63, 4 receptions, 30 receiving yards. Again, 22 touches, 11 fantasy points. If we're going to be in a situation in which, of course, he is given the ample opportunity, expect him to still be a top 24 running back option within the given week. Moving on to our number 24, speaking of, solid production and getting themselves ample opportunity, DeAndre Swift, of course, last night, having himself a game of 19 carries and 20 total touches. Okay, that's the most overall rushing yards that he has seen since week 8 and the most rushing attempts he has seen since week 5. If they continue to commit to the running game, of course, DeAndre Swift should be a fantastic option. Unfortunately, had a touchdown called back because of, one of the offensive linemen that came into the game, lined up at fullback, and unfortunately did not report himself as eligible. Got himself 6 points minus off his scoreline. I'm sure many of you lost fantasy weeks because of those overall situations, but nonetheless, going into this week, taking on the Detroit Lions, again, this Detroit Lions run stop defense has been pretty solid over the course of the last month, but they could not stop the Bills this most recent week. The Bills running backs combined for 129 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, 8 receptions, 156 through the air, and 1 receiving touchdown. Bills running backs this most recent week in a half PPR scored 50.5 total fantasy points. So there's always a possibility that DeAndre Swift could have himself a solid week here, coming off of a great opportunity share in this most recent performance. Moving on to our number 25, we have Tank Bigsby. Now, I've gone ahead and gone back and forth on Tank Bigsby and Etienne over the course of the last couple weeks. In games in which we anticipate a negative game script, Travis Etienne gets majority of the workload because, again, he is a receiving back additionally, so he gets himself the greater opportunity share, even on the ground. In games in which the Jacksonville Jaguars are competing in a close potential contest, anticipate more Tank Bigsby, which will be the case this week against the Las Vegas Raiders. Again, a matchup that is allowing nearly 14 fantasy points per game and 4.2 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs. Thus far this season, Tank Bigsby, when given ample opportunity, has been highly efficient. We would anticipate him to continue that streak of success this week, considering it will be a close matchup against the Las Vegas Raiders. Moving on to our number 26, Kendre Miller. Now, this is purely under the assumption that we do not have Alvin Kamara playing this week. In the event in which Alvin Kamara does end up playing, for those of you who are listening specifically because you have Alvin Kamara on roster, if he does end up playing this week, I'd have him as my number 15th ranked running back in a half PPR. Because again, in the last 4 games in which Alvin Kamara has played in the absence of Derek Carr, he's put up 14.9, 15.2, and 15.0. And of course, 1 game of 5.4. So again, 3 of the last 4 performances without Derek Carr, 14.9 or more fantasy points, which you would anticipate him to potentially find this week against the Green Bay Packers. Again, the most recent 4 games without Derek Carr, we have seen Alvin Kamara, even in this most recent game, leaving early with an injury, still accumulating a total of 21 receptions. If you're going to get yourself 5 receptions per game on average, in the absence of Derek Carr, you would assume that even against the Packers, you should still be able to find success. And even if Alvin Kamara does not play, Kendre Miller still be given an ample share of opportunity to be a top 30 option at the running back position. Moving on to our number 27, we have Tyrone Tracy Jr. It's purely just going to be a matter of, will this offense ever stop handing the ball off to Devin Singletary on the goal line? He has stolen a rushing touchdown in 2 of the last 4 games, which has certainly hurt many fantasy managers over the course of the season. Again, he could have had himself 4 consecutive games of over 10 fantasy points if he had scored those touchdowns. But unfortunately, Devin Singletary is coming in and taking, the opportunity share that really does belong to Tyrone Tracy as a starting running back. Nonetheless, the fact that, of course, he got a touchdown vulture and didn't get any receiving utilization does not bode well for Tyrone Tracy going into the given week. Hopefully, he is given a greater share of opportunity because it'll be a closer matchup. Primarily because, of course, the Atlanta Falcons cannot score as an offense. If that does take place, of course, Tyrone Tracy could certainly be of value this week. Moving on to our number 28, we have Travis Etienne. Look, Travis Etienne is still going to get himself an opportunity share, whether it is on the ground or through the air, coming off of a performance of 18 total touches and 85 total yards. I don't expect him to get that many touches once again this week. I will expect to see a lot more potential Tank Bigsby because of the matchup against the Las Vegas Raiders. Again, regardless of who's playing quarterback for the Raiders, this is going to be a closer scoring event in which both these teams will be running the ball consistently. And of course, Travis Etienne will be able to find himself upside in those circumstances. Moving on to our number 29, Isiah Pacheco. Again, we can't trust him. The fact of the matter is he has lost all of his efficiency. I would honestly just like for the Chiefs to just leave him on the bench and just continue to roll out Kareem Hunt, because when Kareem Hunt was the starter, we were at least getting solid fantasy production within a single running back within this offense. But unfortunately, over the course of the last couple weeks since returning, it has just been a complete disaster. Again, one of the primary values for Isiah Pacheco besides touchdowns has been receiving upside. Back in 2023, in the final 8 games of his season, including the NFL playoffs, he was averaging 4 receptions per game. The fact that he is not getting that kind of opportunity share anymore, again, certainly has hurt him for fantasy purposes. Moving on to our number 30, we have Jaylen Warren. Of course, Jaylen Warren at any given week can score 8 to 10 fantasy points. He could also put up a 2-point performance like he did most recently, but I would anticipate very similar in which he did against the Baltimore Ravens back in week 11. 8.8 fantasy points on a total of 13 touches could very easily be within the realm of possibility this upcoming week. Moving on to our number 31, we have Rhamondre Stevenson. The only thing that worries me about Rhamondre Stevenson is game script. Again, I've mentioned it before and I'll mention it again. The Bills have scored 30 plus points as a team in 8 consecutive games. That is a negative game script, which makes it a disastrous situation for Rhamondre Stevenson, because without rushing attempts, he will certainly find himself a significantly lesser volume of opportunity, considering that we may see a lot more Antonio Gibson within the upcoming matchup. Even though the Bills matchup on the ground is advantageous, I don't expect to see the New England Patriots being able to keep up with them in regards to their firepower and scoring on a consistent basis. Moving on to our number 32, Gus Edwards. This is purely here in the event in which he scores a touchdown. Last time out against the Denver Broncos, we saw J.K. Dobbins accumulate 25 rushing attempts. In the event in which Gus Edwards is given that kind of share of opportunity, and of course, hopefully finds the end zone, he should be a top 36 ranked running back. But again, very sketchy in the current iteration of this offense. Then we move on to our number 33, Jerome Ford. He has moved down significantly within my rankings, primarily because, again, they did mention that DTR will be starting a quarterback this week. Even with Nick Chubb out with a broken foot, and even though Jerome Ford thus far this season is averaging 5.18 yards per carry, and in games in which he is being given 12 or more touches, he's averaging nearly 10 fantasy points per game. Even though it's a great matchup against the Bengals, I don't know if they're going to be able to even get first downs with DTR at quarterback. Again, DTR has not been great when given opportunity over the course of the last 2 seasons. Then we move on to our number 34, Alexander Mattison. This is under the assumption that Sincere McCormick, unfortunately, with the injury he sustained last night, may not be able to continue. If in fact he's not able to, of course, we have Alexander Mattison taking on the Jaguars, the 5th best matchup at the position, allowing 17.5 fantasy points per game and 4.5 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs since week 6. Then we move on to 35, Tyjae Spears. Purely going to be dependent on the status of Tony Pollard. If Tony Pollard misses, expect Tyjae Spears to be a top 15 back within my rankings, taking on the Colts, the 8th best matchup at the position. But again, we're going to have to wait and see exactly how this transpires. And we do know that Will Levis has been benched, which is certainly, in my opinion, a positive sign for this attack. And of course, any sort of running back upside, because it will be a closer matchup within the given week. Then to close out, we have Zach Charbonnet. Again, this is under the assumption that Kenneth Walker plays, but I still would anticipate Zach Charbonnet to get himself a couple touches here and there, if not potentially even split the backfield and be a higher ranked running back in comparison to number 36 by week's end. Either way, this is going to cover my top 36 running back rankings. Thank you everybody for watching. Again, I'll be back live tonight starting at 7 p.m. PST. If you have any questions, be sure to swing on by. I'll be back tomorrow with my top 40 wide receiver rankings. And until next time, thank you everybody for watching, and I'll see you guys. Peace.